This is WD
FM, the official Walt Disney Family Museum podcast. We're your hosts, Bree Bertolacini, Marketing Manager, and
Chris Mullen, Marketing Assistant at the Walt Disney Family Museum. Today we're exploring the creation of Walt Disney's first feature-length animated film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. This groundbreaking film redefined animation and entertainment for families around the world.
The story begins with the opening of a storybook, and once upon a time, there lived a little princess with hair black as ebony, lips red as a rose, and skin white as snow. Magic mirror on the wall, who is the fairest one of all? With these lines spoken by the queen to hear Magic mirror, the story of Snow White begins in earnest. Each day, the queen asks this question, and as long as the magic mirror answers that the queen herself is fairest, Snow White is safe from her stepmother's jealousy.
But as we watch, the queen approaches the mirror and receives an unwelcome answer. There is another more fair than she. The magic mirror's words are enigmatic, but the queen knows her rival can only be Snow White. Green with envy, the vain queen orders her loyal huntsman to take the princess deep into the impenetrable woods and kill her. In an act of unprecedented kindness, the huntsman spares the maiden's life, and Snow White finds refuge in the cottage of 7 friendly dwarves. The dwarves grow to love their unexpected visitor, who cleans their house, cooks their meals, and cares for them.
But one day, while the dwarves are working in their diamond mine, the queen arrives at the cottage, disguised as an old hag, and persuades Snow White to bite into a poisoned apple. The dwarves, warned by the forest animals, rush home to chase the witch away. But they are too late to save Snow White from the poisoned apple, which causes her to fall into a sleeping death. They place her in a glass coffin in the woods and mourn for her. The prince, who earlier had fallen in love with Snow White, happens by and awakens her from the wicked queen's death-like spell with love's first kiss.
Walt Disney had never produced a full-length feature film. Up to that point, the Walt Disney Studios had seen great commercial success with Mickey Mouse and had critical acclaim with their artistically daring Silly Symphonies series. But as the effects of the Great Depression were taking hold, theater owners were beginning to pass up Disney short cartoons in favor of live-action double features to attract more audiences. Walt knew he had to continue diversifying, and the story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was his first choice for moving into features. But why did he select this famous fairy tale? Let's hear from Walt himself from the 1956 interview with Saturday Evening Post journalist Pete Martin.
I don't know why I picked Snow White. It's a thing I remembered as a kid. I saw Marguerite Clark in it in Kansas City one time when I was a newsboy. They had a big showing for all the newsboys, and I went and saw Snow White. It's probably one of my first big feature pictures I'd ever seen. That was back in 1917 or 8 or 16, somewhere way back. But anyways, to me, I thought it was a perfect story. I had the sympathetic dwarfs and things. I had the heavy. I had the prince and the girl, the romance. I just thought it was a perfect story. I think it is one of the most perfect of plots. I mean, it's basic all the way through. You see. From the very start, you have sympathy.
The film Walt was referring to was the 1916 silent film Snow White. This film was inspired by a stage production, adapted by Winthrop Ames from the Brothers Grimm tale. Ames would go on to write the screen adaptation, which would feature the same leading actress, Marguerite Clark. Clark had played Snow White in the musical stage play for 2 seasons before starring in the film in the same role. Interestingly enough, Clark was 33 years old when playing the 16-year-old Snow White in the film. The film took some liberties with the original Grimm's fairy tale, aspects that greatly inspired Walt's new retelling of the tale. Unlike the Brothers Grimm story, Winthrop Ames borrowed heavily from another popular European folktale, Cinderella, adding a young Snow White as a kitchen servant. Walt also drew inspiration from the 1916 film's mine scene where the 7 dwarves mined for gems.
To back up even further, the original story was published by the Brothers Grimm in 1812 in the first edition of their collection, Grimm's Fairy Tales. It was titled, in German, Sneewittchen, which translates directly to Snow White. The fairy tale features the story elements of the magic mirror, the poisoned apple, the glass coffin, the evil queen, and the seven dwarves. In the Grimm's tale, the apple was poisoned, but it did not kill Snow White because she never actually swallowed it. Instead, pieces of the apple lodged in her throat. At the story's end, when her apparently dead body was accidentally jostled, the pieces of the apple were dislodged. She coughed them up and instantly revived.
With the story picked, it was time to put Walt's own personal touches to it. But before Walt had the opportunity to pitch the idea to his team of animators, the word had gotten around about the possibility of making a full-length feature film. Here is Disney legend animator Frank Thomas recalling his memories of this period from his interview for Walt, the Man Behind the Myth.
I think the fellow I was working with, Freddie Moore, who was one of the best animators there, a beautiful draftsman, unique style, had more appeal in his drawings than anyone else could get. He would see Walt and he'd be in different meetings and he'd say, hey, you know, they're talking about making a feature-length picture called Snow White. And I said, no, what? You're going to give up the shorts? The shorts are, just going to get hold of them. We were pretty confused about what he was doing, why he was doing a feature in the first place, what made him think that he could sustain the audience and entertainment for a whole feature length. And so we were all a little nervous about it.
One night after dinner at the Hyperion studio in late 1934, Walt invited several of his artists to the soundstage to share his idea for the upcoming project, Snow White and the Seven Dwarves. To highlight the story, he sat beneath a single light bulb and acted out every single scene in a marathon session to the amusement of his animators. For example, the moment the evil queen gave Snow White the magic wishing apple, Walt portrayed the hunched-over old hag, arching his eyebrows in a dramatic fashion, in order to emphasize the gravitas of the scene. The performance took 2 hours, and at the end, when Prince's kiss awakened the sleeping Snow White, there were tears in the eyes of his listeners. Here is Frank Thomas again, recalling the night.
We sat around in half circles, I recall, and he started telling the story. And of course, typical of Walt, he was a terrific actor, but he couldn't do it by memorizing lines or doing anything that rehearsed. But he would just say, you know, the queen cuts up here and does this, and Snow White's down here, and he's scrubbing away on this, and she's singing someday, and here comes the prince on his horse, you know. He just acts out every part of it spontaneously as he's giving the lines of dialogue that he's writing at the time. Kept changing the dialogue, trying to get it to fit in right with the character he was developing.
And with that, here's a clip from animator Ollie Johnston recalling that night as well.
He called a meeting and had a large group over on the soundstage one evening, and he went through and told the story. And, I was just spellbound by it. And then he even acted out some stuff, as I recall. And he was a great actor, wonderful, spontaneous actor. He'd be telling something, and he'd say, well, let's say like this, you know, and he'd get up and do the stuff and have you all laughing at what he was talking about. And you'd visualize what he was presenting to you. It's amazing. The guy thought in terms of entertainment, and that was the wonderful thing about him, and that's what I guess made us all so loyal to him, because he was doing something that was good for the public and good for all of us to work at.
That was so great to hear. And following Walt's one-man show, the artists were inspired and determined to bring Walt's vision to the big screen. In our episode on the Silly Symphonies, we heard from Walt about starting an in-house art school in 1932, led by instructor Don Graham. By 1934, he made the Disney Art School a full-time operation and put Don Graham on the payroll to work 3 days at the studios and 2 nights teaching classes. The night classes were quickly expanded to 5 nights a week, with 150 students attending classes in animation, character drawings, layouts, and backgrounds. Here's legendary Warner Brothers animator and filmmaker Chuck Jones' thoughts on Walt's training school.
One of the greatest moves that Walt ever did was when he hired Don Graham when they were doing Snow White, and he wanted to have people help to draw human characters, like Snow White.
300 artists were needed to work at the studio to help with the larger output of work. Finishing Snow White, yes, but also Silly Symphonies and other shorts featuring Disney's growing stable of stars, such as Donald Duck, Goofy, and Pluto. The Disney Studio facility on Hyperion Avenue wasn't designed to accommodate the number of artists required to finish the film. Animators were wall-to-wall and shoulder-to-shoulder with each other at the Hyperion lot, and yet, while uncomfortable, many artists felt like these close quarters fostered collaboration and creativity.
One of the greatest technical difficulties in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was an animation of the human characters: Snow White, the Prince, and the Queen. Artists with special skills in drawing human anatomy were assigned to these characters. Roy O. Disney recalled, quote, "There were quite a few artists on Snow White who were not real good artists in those days. The good men were scarce, so Walt devised a way of breaking down the key fill-ins and the follow-ups of more simple art. It was kind of making it a progression of work. Like almost, you might say, the assembly line. But that was the way he spread more good men over more work," end quote.
Walt devoted much of his time to the story elements of the film. To help with that process, a Disney innovation of the 1930s was key to the development process: the storyboard. Walt said to animator Ted Sears on December 23, 1935, quote, "I honestly feel that the heart of our organization is the story department. We must have good stories. We must have them well worked out. We must have people in there who can not only think up ideas, but who can carry them through and sell them to the people who have to do with the completion of the thing," end quote. Composing a story this long with such complex characters was not an easy task. Here's animator Frank Thomas explaining some of the growing pains of developing the story.
And it was painful, of course, to Walt, but he was just beginning to realize not only the problems you had with the feature film, but the opportunities. And that way, one thing would play against another. He'd never gone into that form of acting.
In a 1934 outline titled Manuscript, the story included a scene in which the Queen captured the prince and held him captive in her dungeon. It also included Snow White's elaborate journey through settings like Boogieland, the Valley of the Dragons, and the Morass of Monsters, although most of these ideas didn't make it into the film.
Story writers and animators made contributions at the conferences, but it was always Walt's voice that dominated, suggesting camera angles, indicating moods, and most valuable of all, acting out his concept of the dialogue in action. Sometimes he cited his own experience. In 1936, he was invited to the annual encampment of the Bohemian Club, a San Francisco organization of artists and civic figures. The ritual consisted of wining, feasting, and camping out in Bohemian Grove in Monterey, California, north of the San Francisco Bay. When Walt returned to the studio, he complained of being unable to sleep because of the symphony of snores in nearby tents. He described and reproduced each of the snores to the raucous laughter of his storymen. The result was the snoring sequence in the Dwarves' Cottage.
Amongst the story writers was Dorothy Ann Blank. Hired in 1936 to develop stories for animation, she joined Bianca Majoli and Grace Huntington as some of the earliest story women at Disney. Fun fact, Bianca Majoli went to McKinley High School with Walt in Chicago. Dorothy was one of the earliest writers to get Snow White and Seven Dwarfs underway and developed the earliest story treatments for the film, extracting key story points and developing character descriptions. She also wrote key dialogue for Snow White and defined script structures. Dorothy Blank helped to define the story research department that is still fundamental at the Walt Disney Studios today.
Walt selected his animators with the same thoughtful care that a casting director would take for an all-star ensemble. Freddie Moore, Bill Tytla, Fred Spencer, and newcomer Frank Thomas proved to be the animators who could instill humor and individual characteristics in the dwarves. Norm Ferguson brought the witch to life. Ham Lusk accepted the challenge of making Snow White move with human grace. Grim Natwick was a lead animator for both Snow White and the Prince. Young animators, and future Disney legends, Milt Kahl, Eric Larson, and Jim Algar, animated the Animal Friends.
Grim Natwick, who had designed Betty Boop for Fleischer Studios and had gone on to animate other female characters at the Ub Iwerks studio, was recruited for the feature because of his skill with feminine characters. One of Natwick's assistant animators was future Disney legend Mark Davis, who would become indispensable both in animation and later Imagineering for Disneyland.
All of the artists drew inspiration from the preliminary sketches of Albert Herder and Gustav Tengren. Each day in the dailies, the rough sequences were reviewed in the sweatbox with Walt, supervising director Dave Hand, individual sequence directors Bill Cottrell, Wilford Jackson, Ben Sharpstein, Larry Morey, and Perce Pierce. For the Seven Dwarfs Cottage, the design created by Disney layout artists was loosely based on Bavarian forest cottages, not any one specific building. Artist Ken Anderson built a full-size model of the cottage that the staff could use to help stage the action and determine camera angles.
Of all the technical challenges in producing Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, none was more daunting than creating human characters who acted and moved in a convincing way. The characters weren't intended to be strictly realistic, but they had to represent a fantasy element that was grounded in reality. The Disney studios met this challenge by filming live-action reference footage of actors cast in these roles. Let's hear from Walt.
Things weren't right. I had to do them over. The animation wasn't living up to what I wanted. I had the problem of drawing a girl. It was quite a problem. You can make a good drawing, one drawing of a girl, but to get all the shadings and all the things, the little arch of the nose and different things like that, and make it move and turn, and keep it simple enough that it can be traced and be duplicated and all of that was quite a problem. So we went through quite a bit of experimenting to do that. There's where I begin to use the models for it. For this action, the movement of the action, now, I had to have something besides the artist's imagination. In other words, they used to look in mirrors and they do things, but the artists sometimes can be bad actors, and their timing can be wrong. So I decided to use models.
The live-action model for the character of Snow White was a young actress named Marge Belcher. After production on the film wrapped, she married Disney animator Art Babbitt. She later married dancer Gower Champion, becoming Marge Champion. Marge passed away October 21st, 2020, at age 101. Here is Frank Thomas talking about working with Marge.
Marge Champion, who was the model for Snow White, was very cooperative. She's a good dancer, and she could do all of these various little girlish poses and things. And she said at one time they couldn't trace her. Like, that looks terrible if you do that in rotoscope. It doesn't work on a character like this. You have to understand what she is doing and why she is doing it, how it fits into the picture, why that scene is in the picture. You have to know all of these things. And then as an actor, you have to be able to give it out to where the audience can identify with her feelings. And her head was too small for the work with the drawings. They would make photostats of the drawings. They wouldn't trace it. They'd make photostats of it. And you would study them and study them. And you'd find out how she moved, what her shoulders did, what her back did, how her neck worked and everything, so that you could get these feminine gestures that they wanted. So some days they tried putting a football helmet on her so her head would be bigger. And she said, that didn't last very long, trying to act with a football helmet on.
Marge Champion is just such a phenomenal name in Disney history. I just have to say that right out the gate. Walt struggled to find a voice to be his leading lady. Here is Walt talking about how he found the perfect voice.
I found a voice. I wanted to get a voice for Snow White. It would be kind of away from everyday, kind of off in another world, and I was hunting for a certain quality voice. So I had one of the boys searching for voices. He went everywhere. He went to, I want someone who could sing, too, because we're going to use a lot of songs. So he kept bringing these people in. Now, I didn't want to be thrown by looking at the person, because I only wanted their voice. So the sound stage was right next to my office. We had a microphone there, and in my office, I had a big speaker. Now, I'd be working all around the studio, and I'd get a call from him. He had a voice. He wanted me to hear it. Now, the person who was coming in to audition didn't know that I was listening. They were doing a little test in a microphone that let them relax. He'd call me. I'd leave whatever meeting I was in. I'd come into my office, turn on my speaker, and then this voice would come. And he'd pick up the phone. He'd say, "What do you think?" So we kept hunting for voices. Every day there'd be 2 or 3 coming in I'd listen to. One day he called me all excited. He says, "I have a 14-year-old girl. He says she has a terrific voice." I says, "I can put her on right away." I said, "Put her on." I dashed in and I listened. His voice came out. It was a beautiful soprano, but it sounded like someone around 30, between 20 and 30. He called. He says, "What do you think?" I says, "No, she sounds too old, too mature." I said, "I got to get something that's thinner, something that seems younger." He's too mature. He says, "Well, she's good, isn't she?" "Yes, but I said she sounds too old." So I turned her down. That was Dina Durbin. So that one day he come in with a voice, and I listened to it. I said, "That's perfect." I said, "She sounds to me like a 14-year-old girl." He said, "Well, she's 18, But it was it. It was a little girl called Adriana Casalati. And she came from an opera family. And her sister was famous Carmen. But she had that training, she could do all this beautiful bird-like stuff. So I signed her.
That was so wonderful to hear. And here is another clip, this one with Betty Kimball, who worked in the ink and paint department and later would marry animator Ward Kimball. Hear her talk about how she helped with the voice of Snow White.
Ham Musk wanted to do a scene, and they hadn't chosen a voice yet for Snow White, so he had me do the dialogue in the scene. "Oh, I didn't mean to frighten you, but you don't know what I've been through and all, because I was afraid." And I did it until I came to the song, and I said, "I can't sing." And he said, "That's all right." And later, Casalati told me that she had the hardest time matching her dialogue to mine because she said it differently than I did. And she had to speak with the action that they had already timed and then go into the song.
Wow, I didn't realize that Betty Kimball helped out with the voice of Snow White. You learn something new every day on this podcast. Walt recognized the difficulty of establishing the 7 dwarves, each with a recognizable quality. Prior to this, his biggest challenge on this front was the 3 little pigs, 3 years earlier. His solution was to name them each for their defining characteristics. Over 50 names and corresponding traits were proposed for the dwarves. Some of the rejected dwarf names included Cranky, Hungry, Thrifty, and Nifty. Love Nifty, personally. The outline narrowed down the 50 names to 7 and listed all but 1. Happy, Sleepy, Doc, Bashful, Jumpy, Grumpy, and 7th, who would later get the name of Dopey, was described as the following. Quote, "Deaf, always listening intently. Happy, quick movements, spry," end quote.
Sterling Holloway was noted in the outline of what Walt referred to during production as the, quote, 7 little men, to voice Sleepy. Holloway didn't end up voicing Sleepy. The role went to Pinto Colvig, the voice of Goofy, but he would go on to have an illustrious career with Disney at some very notable characters such as Winnie the Pooh, the Cheshire Cat, and Kaa, just to name a few. Here's a great clip of Walt talking about the genesis of the Dwarves and some fun facts about Dopey.
We had a lot of trouble with the Dwarfs. You see, I had to use different artists because there's so much work to be done. There had to be quite a group of artists all working on the Dwarfs, and I had quite a time with some of them. And I set the personalities. I wanted to, no doubt about the personalities, so I sort of picked a name to fit the personality. So when I had bashful, he was bashful. I had happy, he was happy. I had dopey, he was dopey. And dopey, there's quite a bit of controversy on whether I should call him dopey. They said, oh, that's too modern a word and things. We found out that Shakespeare used it. Really? Yes, he used that. He couldn't talk, and as we had to have to explain, he said, well, he just never tried. And I got voices for everybody, but we couldn't find a voice for dopey. So we said, well, let's let him be mute. We just won't give him a voice. That'll make him different. And it worked.
That was great. For the additional characters, the Queen received the most detailed description. In an outline of her character, she was described as, quote, a mixture of Lady Macbeth and the Big Bad Wolf. Her beauty is sinister, mature, plenty of curves. She becomes ugly and menacing when scheming and mixing her potions. Magic fluids transform her into an old, witch-like hag. Her dialogue and actions are over-melodramatic, verging on the ridiculous. End quote.
What a description.
Yeah, right? That nailed her, though. I mean, it makes sense, though. You know, a villain, you'll want to be completely fleshed out so that you know their motivations and where they're coming from. So I totally get that. Through the Queen's transformation into a witch, the Disney Snow White story returns to its source material. The Queen has magical powers that allow her to conjure a witchy disguise. Ruben Mamoulian's 1931 production of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, with its iconic spinning room scene, appears to strongly influence the scene in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, where the Queen drinks the magic potion. The same actress, Lucille Laverne, voiced both the Queen and the witch. Sequence director Bill Cottrell recalled that she made the switch from one voice to the other simply by taking out her false teeth. Wow. Fun fact, I thought that was a fun fact. Fun fact, the voice behind the magic mirror was created by having Maroney Olson speak his lines while donning a box frame covered with old drum heads.
The Prince posed a huge animation challenge. During story development, extensive scenes were suggested for the Prince's character. But as the artist confronted the sheer difficulty of moving the character convincingly, his scenes were scaled back. In the finished film, he appears only briefly at the beginning and end as an anonymous figure of romance, as in the original Grimm story. Towards the end of the production, Walt reviewed a nearly completed version of the film, and he noticed when the prince leaned over to kiss Snow White in her glass coffin, he shimmied. Something had gone wrong in the camera work or the animation. Walt told Roy he wanted to redo the filming of the scene, but upon hearing it would cost tens of thousands of dollars, Roy responded, quote, forget it, let the prince shimmy, end quote. And he's been shimmying ever since. Here's Walt again.
It was fun all the way through. I mean, it was quite a thrill. And the fact that we were building this and testing, I was always testing to see if it would hold up. And it was always fun. It was a fight. It was a heck of a fight two ways. We were running out of money. We got down to, I had a lot to do on it yet. And we were trying to get it out. I wanted to get it out for December sometime, around the winter season. It's a good season. I enjoyed Christmas.
I agree, Walt. The winter season is a good season. In his speech accepting the Showman of the World Award from the National Association of Theater Owners on October 1st, 1966, Walt recalled, quote, but we had decided there was only one way we could successfully do Snow White, and that was to go for broke, shoot the works. There would be no compromise on money, talent, or time. We did not know whether the public would go for a cartoon feature, but we were darn sure that the audiences would not buy a bad cartoon feature. As the Snow White budget climbed, I did begin to wonder whether we would ever get our investment back, end quote. And here is Curt Walker president of what was known at the time as Walt Disney Productions, now as the Walt Disney Company, talk about Walt's favorite banker.
Well, there's one banker that he loved, and that was Joe Rosenberg. When Walt was finishing Snow White, it hadn't finished yet. He needed, in this case, I think he needed about over $500,000. And Joe Rosenberg then was with the Bank of America and in charge of motion picture loans. And he came out and was going to see the picture and evaluate how much money they could give Walt. Well, a lot of the picture was not finished, so Walt would ad-lib it and all the things, act it out and show him how it was or show him stills. And then the meeting was over, and Joe and Walt walked out to Joe's car, and Joe said to Walt, he said, "Don't worry a minute." He said, "This is going to make a pot full of money." And that banker Walt liked.
The risk was immense. Roy, who managed the finances, wrote to his parents in Portland with a mixture of concern and confidence in his brother's vision, stating, quote, "We are taking all the risk ourselves, so if it goes kaflooey, we may be up there living with you in your rooming house. Save me the front room in the other place next door to you, will you? But I have all the confidence in the world that Walt can build a good feature and that it will go out and make a lot of money in gross. 3, 4, or 5 years from now, we can tell you much better. Anyways, that is life. You just have to keep on working and gambling. It is all a gamble." End quote.
Just have to keep on working and gambling. It's a little bit like Walt's Keep Moving Forward, but it includes gambling, which is funny.
Well,
also,
and finances.
Yeah, true.
Like
true.
Roy was the finance guy, so I could see why he was thinking of gambling money.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at how Roy felt about Walt's projects overall, he might have felt that a lot of that was gambling. But of course, the confidence of knowing that Walt usually had what the audience wanted in mind made it less so of a gamble. Also, I have to take an opportunity to say kaflooey. I don't want Bree to be the only one that gets to say kaflooey, so I'm taking my moment right now, kaflooey. As production was underway, word gets out about this next big project. Members of the press anointed it as Disney's Folly, predicting that no audience would want to see a feature-length cartoon. Even Roy and Lily privately shared their doubts with Walt. On December 21st, 1937, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs premiered at Hollywood's Carthay Circle Theater. Here's Walt to talk about that.
In December, we had a big premiere, the Carthay Circle Theater.
I didn't know that then.
Big, grand Hollywood premiere. It was quite a climax to something, because it went way back.
This is the first premiere time you'd ever premiered one of your pictures?
First premiere. And it was all the Hollywood brass turned out for a cartoon.
My God,
that was the thing. And it went way back to when I first came out here. And I went to the first premiere, and I was all, I've never seen in my life. I went down, I saw all these Hollywood celebrities coming in, and I just had a funny feeling there. I just said, maybe someday they'll be going to a premiere of a cartoon, because people would appreciate the cartoon. They kind of looked on. It was an exciting thing to have that premiere. And, gosh, the darn thing went out and grossed $8 million around the world.
Well, it's funny. It's funny to me that, with the blessing of hindsight, that anyone could see animated features not being really successful. So it always makes me laugh when you think of the press thinking, who would sit for an hour-and-a-half cartoon when our feature-length cartoons nowadays get much longer than that, but still keep our attention and keep our interest and keep us loving these characters.
Yes, and this is astounding because at the time, this is during the Great Depression, so adult admission was 25 cents, and this film made $8 million in its first release, which today would be over $140 million. So within 6 months, Walt and Roy had paid off all of their bank loans. Here is a clip of a young Diane Disney Miller recalling the first time she watched Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
Oh, I'll tell you a very early memory I have, which is very, very early, is Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. That was at the old studio in Hyperion. They were running at the sound stage. This is before Snow White was released. And I guess Well, I remember very well. I was sitting there on the soundstage watching the picture, and when the old witch came on, I was so terrified. I was sitting there with my hands in front of my face, peeking through my fingers, or not peeking at all, and crying. So terribly afraid that they took me out.
Was Daddy with you?
Into the sunlight. Yes, Daddy was there.
Was he interested in your reaction?
Well, he was interested in my reaction. He was a little bit upset at me.
Okay, so adult admission was 25 cents, but how much was the popcorn? That's what I want to know. Here is Chuck Jones's reaction to seeing Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs at the Carthay Circle Theater when it debuted.
When Snow White came out, I managed to finagle a couple of tickets to it and at the Carthay Circle Theater. And oh boy, I was really knocked out. I was completely devastated in a wonderful way of seeing Snow White, because it's so far from anything else I'd ever seen. To see that magnificent thing, and it destroyed me, really. If this was possible, anything was possible.
Critics and audiences were unanimously enthusiastic about the film. Attendance records were broken. The Seven Dwarfs became immediate icons, and the film's songs Hi-Ho and Whistle While You Work were heard on every radio. 1 week after the premiere of the film, Walt Disney appeared on the cover of the December 27, 1937 issue of Time magazine. Critics unanimously voted Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs as one of the best films of 1938, which is reflected in the magazine issues that we have on display of Time, Life, and Film Daily. Alongside these magazine covers we have on display are some actual inner office memos from Walt that he sent out to staff, congratulating them on a job well done for creating such a successful film and including additional copies of these magazines so staff could, quote, save them for their grandchildren, end quote.
A fun story of some of the more dramatic reactions for the film was in February 1938, the British Board of Film Censors made headlines by requiring that Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs be given an A certificate for exhibition in England. As a result, children under 16 would not be admitted to see the film. There was a public outcry on the ban. The last vestige of opposition crumbled when it was reported that Princess Elizabeth and Margaret had watched a showing of Snow White in Buckingham Palace and had suffered no ill effects.
Well, there you go. If it's good enough for the royals, then it's good enough for all of us, right? Now, at long last, it is time for the fun and fancy facts segment of our show. In honor of our topic today, we've got 7, count 'em, 7 fun and fancy facts for your enjoyment.
Well, first on the list is about the Special Academy Award that was presented to Walt Disney for Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. This special award is on display in our awards lobby, and it has one full-size statuette alongside 7 smaller Oscar statuettes cascading down a single base.
Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is the only film to have been honored by the Academy in 2 successive years. The first honor came in the year of the film's release, 1937, when it was nominated for Best Music. The following year, the Academy presented Walt with his Special Academy Award. The Academy honored Snow White as, quote, a significant screen innovation which has charmed millions and pioneered a great new entertainment field, end quote. At the awards ceremony, Shirley Temple unveiled the statuette, exclaiming to Walt, quote, isn't it so bright and shiny?
A common rumor we hear at the museum is that Walt was dissatisfied with the award because in the footage of him receiving the award, people think he appears to be unhappy. However, there is nothing documented of Walt having anything bad to say about the award. In the regarded Walt biography by Bob Thomas, Walt Disney, an American original, we highly recommend this book, he writes, quote, such an appearance before his peers caused an uncommon lack of ease. The 10-year-old Shirley Temple, noticing his demeanor when she presented him with the Snow White Oscar, commented, don't be nervous, Mr. Disney, end quote.
Also on that same special Oscar, there's only been one other time that an Oscar statuette has been customized. The year prior to when Walt received his award, famous actor and ventriloquist Edgar Bergen was presented with an honorary award for his outstanding comedy creation, Charlie McCarthy. It was a wooden Oscar statuette with a movable mouth. Edgar Bergen would later have a role in Disney's Fun and Fancy Free in 1947 and on Walt's first television special, 1 Hour in Wonderland. Brie, I think if we mention the film Fun and Fancy Free, that has to be the best fun and fancy fact, just in my opinion.
I agree. Another one of Snow White's special awards was her own star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, presented on June 28, 1987 for the film's 50th anniversary. An honor of a lifetime for a live-action performer. It's an even rarer feat for animated characters. Other Disney characters with stars on the Hollywood Walk of Fame include Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, and Winnie the Pooh.
In 1989, Snow White was among the first 25 featured films to be preserved in the Library of Congress's National Film Registry. And in 2008, it was named the greatest animated film of all time by the American Film Institute. Each year since 1989, the U.S. government, through the Library of Congress, names 25 films it deems as, quote, culturally, historically, or aesthetically important. 19 Disney films have been added to the registry. Fantasia in 1990, Pinocchio in 1994, Steamboat Willie in 1998, Beauty and the Beast in 2002, Toy Story in 2005, Three Little Pigs in 2007, Bambi in 2011, Mary Poppins in 2013, The Old Mill and the Story of Menstruation in 2015, The Lion King, Dumbo in 2017, Cinderella in 2018, and finally Old Yeller and Sleeping Beauty in 2019.
What a list. Well, number 3, the studio publicity team invented and then subsequently circulated the myth of women of the ink and paint department applying their own rouge and other assorted makeup on the cells for Snow White's character. While the part about makeup was made up, it was nonetheless a meticulous process to apply the concoction that resulted in the perfect amount of blush on Snow White's cheeks. Here's an excerpt from historian Mindy Johnson's book, Ink and Paint, The Women of Walt Disney Animation, about the realities of the process. Quote, "The shade of paint for Snow White's skin was applied as usual on the back of the cell, and then a light application of a transparent stain solution was strategically applied on the front of the cell. The stain absorbed into the porous plastic surface, giving the appearance of a gentle rouge-like blend. To maintain this glow on Snow White's face consistently across hundreds of cells, this delicate solution required an exacting application to the front of the cells across the action of each scene. Essentially, the women were animating the color." Here is ink and painter Betty Kimball recalling applying the paint for Snow White.
I remembered matching the colors to all the layers of celluloid so that the celluloid has color when you pack a lot of cells together. So if you were on one of the top levels, you had to have duller colors than if you were on the bottom level. And I would match the colors so that the top level looked the same color would look on the bottom level of the cell. And I worked with background painters on that. The only time that the inking and painting department mixed with the masculine part of the studio when we would work with the background painters. We sometimes did some of the voices in silly symphonies, but on Snow White, we just were a department by ourselves.
Very fascinating. Number 4 on our list. A fun story that is told in the galleries is the story of the deleted soup sequence by Ward Kimball. The soup sequence was a musical number, quote, music in your soup, that depicted the dwarves slurping their soup and Snow White trying to teach them proper dining etiquette. The scene took roughly 8 months and 8 animators to develop and animate. Here is Ward Kimball to tell the story.
I did a soup sequence for Snow White. That was very funny. Everybody laughed, and so did Walt. Right after the dwarfs wash up, she calls them in, dang, 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 and she serves soup to them. All the funny ways that they slurp the soup, especially Dopey. And some guys do with the spoons and all kinds of tricks. And Walt looked at the picture in the rough in those days about 10 times a day. He'd look at that, what was the footage that was coming in. And it came to him, because he'd never done a feature before, that something was wrong at the point where the dwarfs wash up. And he called me up to his office. He says, I've been looking at the film, and I'm going to have to take out the soup sequence. I'd spent 8 months on it. And he gave me a reason. He says, I've got to get back to the witch. And because we're waiting too long to get back and see her figuring out the poison apple. It kind of hurt. I went home that day and I said, I've been taken out of the picture. But he came right in the next conversation and said, but I've got a character that you should work on. We're setting up storyboards on Pinocchio, and I have this little creature, the cricket, and he's going to run through the whole plot. I'd like to have you work on it. And so right away I felt a little better that day, because he was a salesman, and he changed the soup sequence into the enjoyment I would have with Jiminy Cricket. It was based on the genius of the man of figuring out that something was wrong with the story at that point. And to this day, I think Snow White's the best picture we ever made. Plot-wise, story-wise. And were decisions like that that made the picture. He took out the dancing above the clouds with the prince that she dreamed of. No, she's scrubbing the sidewalk outside of the palace, and someday my prince will come. And he simplified it. He simplified the action and the story turn so you could follow it.
Well, number 5, if you watch the film carefully, at the close of the film, Snow White is seen kissing only 6 of the dwarves goodbye. Sleepy is the one not shown. Animator Frank Thomas explained that this was one of the final scenes done prior to the release of the film. And the timing of that scene, plus the fixed length of the prince's arms, he could scoop up only 3 at a time, prevented all 7 dwarves from appearing. According to Frank, he was rushed at the end of production of the film and didn't pay attention, so that in the planning of the scene, one of the dwarves was left out. In retrospect, he would have changed the staging to include them all.
We all know what it's like to work up against a deadline. Totally understand that. Number 6 on our list. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was the first feature film to release a soundtrack recording. Walt said, quote, "We should set a new pattern, a new way to use music. Weave it into the story so somebody just doesn't burst into song." All of the film's songs were published in sheet music form, most of them with verses not heard in the film. Several of them became radio hits and were covered by famous musicians. Clarence Nash, the voice of Donald Duck, can be heard in the soundtrack as a whistling bird, hooting owl, part of the dwarves' group exclamations, and the old hag's cackle as the queen brews her potion. Here's Walt talking about the success of the soundtrack.
The Dwarfs really took the country by storm, didn't they, Walt?
Oh, yes. And the music from it. You see now that Hi-Ho, Hi-Ho, it became quite a tune. Carried right on over to the last war, you see. And Someday My Prince Will Come, Whistle While You Work.
It's classic, that Whistle While You Work.
Now, that was written by Churchill. Churchill, who had never done anything like that before he came there. He was the old organist. And I brought in a boy who could write he'd written little verses and things, but he wasn't a professional by the name of Larry Morey. And I brought him in, and he came in to work with story and things. So he just sort of grew up, and he'd never actually written any songs before that.
Last but not least, number 7. The Disney Studios' first animated feature film was the perfect candidate for the Walt Disney Family Museum's first ever special exhibition. Opening in 2012, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, The Creation of a Classic, coincided with the 75th anniversary of the film. The exhibition featured more than 200 works of art, including conceptual drawings, early character studies, detailed story sketches, and animation frames. Guest curated by Leela Smith, then creative director of the Walt Disney Company's Animation Research Library, the exhibition illustrated how Walt used his films to advance the creation of an entirely new art form. Almost 1 million pieces of artwork were created for Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, with the knowledge that most of these would never be seen by the public.
Diane Disney Miller wrote in our 2012 member magazine, quote, "I'm so pleased to introduce the museum's first major special exhibition to you all. One of the first pieces of Disney animation art I acquired was the very small, only 2 by 3 inches, exquisite Gustav Tengren concept painting of a terrified Snow White surrounded by logs that appear as alligators. I acquired it years before we even considered starting a museum, and it was really the beginning of our collection. I'm happy to see it on display in the exhibition. My dad was completely and intimately engaged in it from start to finish. It was truly the first film of its kind, with range and depth of character, an immersive plot, original music that tells the story, and superb artistry. It was, and still is, a masterpiece."
You can still see concept art, merchandise, and even Lillian Disney's Snow White Cartier bracelet worn at the premiere of the film in our main galleries.
In conclusion, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs indicated the new direction of the Disney organization. Shorts would continue to be a staple product, providing a steady income and work for new animators, but features would become the creative thrust of the Disney studios going forward.
We hope you enjoyed venturing beyond the storybook with us. The Magic Mirror told us that you were the fairest listeners in the land, which we wholeheartedly agree.
Make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at WDF Museum to stay updated.
Email us comments and questions at podcast@wdfmuseum.org. You can also visit our website at waltdisney.org to access the show notes for this podcast, as well as the video podcast and our whole archive of previous episodes.
From both of us, keep moving forward.